Well, hello, good morning, wherever you are watching this, whether you're watching this live or watching this after. Welcome to lesson 2 for James. If you want to go back, there is a first lesson in case you missed that, where I give a little bit of an overview of the book and give an overview of how this class works. So feel free to check that out as well. That'll be available, as will all of these videos. For any of you watching for the first time, these classes are aired live every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. So we hope you're able to make this part of your week if you much prefer to join a Sunday school class remotely. There's a couple of ways that you can participate in this class by means of comments. We also made available an email that you can use. The email is questionsforjames@bethelbfc.org. It should be in the show notes, so you can click that link. In case you want to write in a question, if I get anything, I'd love to read them to this class and interact with you as best I can. Well, having said all that, let's get right into the book. We have 2 sections to look at. We'll be looking at verses 9 through 11, which is the discussion on riches and wealth. And then we'll be looking at 12 through 15 on temptations and trials. So if you have a Bible, if you want to pause and go grab one, you'll definitely want one. We'll be looking at these verses quite a bit. So starting with 9 through 11, I'll read the verses. James writes, "Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flower falls and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich fade away in the midst of his pursuits." So James, like I've been saying, he likes to pivot a lot. He likes to go from one topic to another. And then sometimes he even repeats the same theme. He gets bored with one topic and moves to another. And sometimes he adds little details. And sometimes they relate and sometimes they don't. Here you can kind of sense, if you listen to the last week when we talked about being double-minded and what it's like to be tossed around, it could be that he's leading into this subject of wealth because this could have been a pressing issue for his hearers. If these are poor Jewish believers that are struggling with wealth and struggling with poverty, this may have been an issue that he wants to especially address. So let's break this up a little bit. We'll look at first the lowly brother, and then we'll look at the rich. So starting with the lowly brother, it's important to recognize that this term, what does this word lowly mean? Because he contrasts the lowly with the rich. This word lowly only appears a couple of times in the New Testament. It's actually same word that Jesus uses to describe himself when he says that his yoke is easy. He refers to himself as being gentle and lowly in heart, or gentle in heart, as some translations might say. So that certainly includes being economically poor, but it's broader than that. It can include being oppressed, being downcast, having less social capital. And it's very likely that these Jewish converts were experiencing a kind of marginalization in their community. They may have been uninvited from certain feasts, from certain family gatherings, maybe even business transactions. And so it's very likely that these Christians were experiencing a kind of oppression, and they were concerned with, what does that mean for me? What does that mean in terms of God's promises for my life? This was an era in this kind of culture really did believe that having material wealth meant that God was blessing you, meant that you had done well. Maybe your parents had done well, or if you were poor, maybe it was because you had sinned in some way. Well, James, along with other New Testament writers, especially Jesus and Paul, were saying that having material wealth is not a sign of God's favor, and being poor is not a sign of any wrongdoing on your part. In fact, James is going to flip this around and say that it's the poor, it's the lowly who are exalted, and it's the rich who are actually at a disadvantage. Well, let me start with this question before we dig in more. I'll ask this: what makes the lowly brother exalted? Actually, the passage doesn't say why the lowly brother is exalted, but we can use that language and we can use the Bible and we can kind of decipher what's meant here. The word exalted in this context connects well with some other passages that talk about Christ being exalted after the ascension. If you look at Ephesians 4:8, where Christ is ascended, or even Luke 24:49, talking about where the Holy Spirit is, it's this high position that the poor have that's already but not yet in the kingdom. We think of Philippians 3, which says that we are citizens of heaven, or Ephesians 2:6, that says that we are seated in heavenly places. And so to be exalted here is to mean that you are part of Christ's rule. And it's the nature of this upside down kingdom. By the world's standards, the poor and oppressed groups are at the bottom. Well, from the kingdom perspective, what we learn is that those are the people, they're the rulers, they're the ones that are really at the top. And again, it's already but not yet. There's a future reality that's even greater than now, but I think it's something that's true right now, that God, James can say that the poor have an exalted place above the rich. And this passage doesn't say as much about the lowly brother. It actually spends more time talking about the rich, which I think may be appropriate for us. If you're watching this video right now, obviously you have access to technology, phones, the like. You're probably in the first world, and you're probably by global standards rich. So probably means we should pay special close attention to the rich. Well, actually, I'm jumping ahead of myself. Let's say a few more words about the poor. We know that there's a spiritual reality that the poor are exalted, but we also know just from history that the gospel is something that is especially empowering to the poor. It's something that it seems as though God's plan all along was to work through what the world rejected and to give hope to people that had been pushed aside by the world. If you don't need to turn there, but I'd like to read, if I can find it, Isaiah 61, starting at verse 1 says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, and the day of vengeance of God, and to comfort all who mourn." So this message is something that the poor especially delight in. Not just because it's only for the poor, but because the poor, in some ways, they're the first ones to accept it, because they're so ready for something. They're ready to be led out of this captivity. And note that it's not just economics. It's not just wealth. It's there's a kind of binding and captivity going on with people, which affects all of us. Sin is the primary thing that's keeping us. But there's this theme that we see over and over, that this is a message that is for the poor. It's good news for the poor. And why wouldn't it be? Because if you're humiliated in the world's eyes, and then you hear this message that the Lord of all the universe loves you, died for you, right? Not only that, but is going to set everything right, will undo the wrong of every sin and every injustice. That's good news to the poor. Contrasting that with the rich, they have their own things going on, right? They have the resources and the time to pursue their own interests. And so when they hear the call discipleship, they have these other things that they're trying to sort out. They have that. You can think back to the double-mindedness in the previous section. That's why it's harder for the rich to be a follower. So again, having said that, let's move on to the rich. Some people speculate, let me move back to James. Some people speculate that the rich in this section aren't actually believers at all, that they are, if you note that they seem to be, there seems to be this judgment awaiting them, that this is referring to, that this is only referring to unbelievers. I think the better reading is probably that these can be believers, and that this isn't so much in salvific terms, but it's the idea that the identity of being a rich person is something that does not have eternal significance. I think that's the idea. And this is a clear quotation, again, from Isaiah, this time Isaiah 40, talking about the grass withers. It's contrasting the word of the Lord. But James pulls from Isaiah 40. But this is a repeated theme in so much wisdom literature. When you talk about who is actually well off, well, it's the person who lays up their treasures in the place that cannot be taken or stolen or destroyed. Setting your treasures on earth really is unwise, because it will either be destroyed in this life, thieves or material that breaks down, but actually it will be taken from you immediately whether Christ returns or whether we die. Our wealth cannot be taken with us. It's just obvious, but we have a tendency as fallen sinners to make an idol of wealth, to set it up as though that's what's going to anchor ourselves down, so that once we have the wealth, once we have the material possessions, we're good and we don't need God. See, the poor understand, the poor don't put their hope in that, because it's already chaotic for them and they have to look to other things. And I think that's part of what's going on here. So how can the rich be saved? Well, again, I don't think that this is so much salvific terms. The rich and the poor are saved exactly the same way, through faith alone, through Christ alone, through his righteousness and his sacrifice. Just because you're poor doesn't mean you're saved, and just because you're rich doesn't mean you're not saved. We all need the same free gift. I think the point here is to say that the rich will always be at a disadvantage spiritually because of their wealth, for all these reasons that I'm laying out. And, it's interesting. I was reading an NPR study that said that analyzed why the poor people have an easier time giving away their wealth and being generous than the rich. Because the rich, as it turns out, have a harder time not thinking about their wealth. Even though that they're more well off, they live more comfortable lives, they worry and fret about their wealth more than people that have less, partly because they're around other wealthy people and they have this more comparative, and they have this drive to get to that next level. But also they're not in as much close proximity with suffering. They live lives where when you have issues, you have money, you have resources to take care of those problems. When you're of a poor level, you are around more suffering. You see people that are a lower level than you, and you understand all of the problems in the world. And very often that leads to more compassion. It leads to more generosity, even though these people have less. So what should we do? And I say we again, because from global standards, most of you watching this video are wealthy. So I'll ask this question: how should the wealthy respond? Well, I think the command here is not so much that we get rid of our wealth, but that we use our wealth for stewardship. It's not the possession of wealth that's so much the problem. It's the identity of being a rich person who makes their core identity their wealth and the things they use their wealth for their own selfish needs. But I think a good example of this and how this can work out is if you turn to Job. If I have withheld anything that the poor desired, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fall, if I've eaten my morsel alone and the fatherless has not eaten of it, for from my youth the fatherless grew up with me as with a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. If I have not seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or the needy without covering, if his body has not blessed me, and if he has not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless because I saw my help at the gate, then let my shoulder blade fall from my shoulder, and let my arm be broken from its socket. For I was in terror of calamity from God, and I could not have faced his majesty. He goes on with more. You read the chapter. But Job, if you remember, is described as being basically one of the wealthiest men on earth. And God even says there's no one like him. He is a holy, blameless man. But he was using his wealth not just in terms of writing checks to people, but there's an intimacy there. He talks about people eating from his own table. He identifies with the poor and invites them in and uses his wealth for service. So I think that's the aim here. It's to move on from the identity of being wealthy, again, as though we're seeking our own needs and using our wealth. Again, wealth, it's not the possession of wealth. It's how we use the wealth for stewardship. That's pretty much all I had there for that section. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to write a comment or write in an email. Well, now I'd like to move on to the next section, which is verses 12 through 15. If only I had 3 ribbons in this Bible, I could get there faster. Well, James writes in verses 12 to 15 on the subject of trials and temptations. He says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. And then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." So James is revisiting the subject of trials. He introduces this theme a little bit in verses 2 through 3, and then he goes back, but he adds on a little more information. He wants to say something about temptations. So there's 3 T words used in this section. You have trials, tests, and temptations. And they're not all the same. They're a little bit different. But let me start with this question, kind of as a review. The question is, what purpose do trials serve in the life of the Christian? So I covered this in the first lesson when we first looked at this theme in James. But to reiterate, trials are something that James says in the first few verses, that we can count trials as joy because they lead to a kind of endurance and maturity in the life of the Christian. It's not that the trial itself or the difficult things we go through are in themselves good, but that the trial, the result of the trial, can be a good thing. When we think about temptations, though, James wants to be absolutely clear that the temptation cannot come from God. Trials and tests can come from God, but the idea that God is using is tempting us as though He's reeling in a fishing line and He's enticing us to take the bait. It's not like that. The temptations are a natural result of the trial, but the temptation is not at all tied to God in that way. But we think of times in the Bible. You think about Matthew 4, which says Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted, but what does it say? By the devil. Again, God's not the one, but He leads us into those. And God has good purposes in the way that He leads us. And we do sin very often. And that's not blamed on God, that's blamed on us. But He leads us into situations that often naturally involve temptation. But what's the real source of temptation? A source of temptation in verse 14 is us. It's our own desires. So what are desires? I want to think about this for a little bit. Desires are very often good things for the life of the Christian, right? Desires are things that God has given us. There's desires that are really commands in a lot of ways. Commands to love our families, for instance, to take care of ourselves, to take care of our church. There's something good about work. There's something good about rest. But for us, we have desires that grow too large. They become disordered. You think about how we were created to, just give you a few examples. We were created to eat and drink, nourish our bodies. But what do? We get drunk or we become gluttons. We were created to, like I said, work and sustain ourselves. But what do? We distort that by becoming greedy or materialistic, or maybe we cut corners or we cheat or we covet. We were created for sexual intimacy within the context of marriage. But what do? We lust, we have affairs, we look at pornography. And so God has these good desires that end up becoming distorted by our own sinfulness, and they become temptations for us, as this passage says. So follow the logic of these verses. The desire gives birth to sin, and then sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. So something that James does here that I think is very helpful is he breaks apart these stages a little bit for us. It's very often you hear people say, "Oh, it happened so fast," or the next thing I knew, I was doing this. Well, what happened in that? Break it down a little bit. And I think what we have to do with desires is we have to get on the offensive. We have to get one step ahead of Satan. And I think this passage helps us because it helps us to ask the question, well, what are our desires? So let me ask this question. How might Satan exploit your desires? And it might not be necessarily desires to do evil things, but tendencies in our own heart, needs, or Ed Welch uses the term, we're leaky vessels. We're constantly being full because we have these holes we're a cup that can never be full. We have these tendencies in our heart. We have this desire for intimacy. We have this desire to be successful, or we have this desire to be thought of by others. Those are those areas where I think Satan is going to be most active. He's not interested in attacking you where you're the strongest. He wants to get you where you're the weakest. And in many ways, we're only as strong as our weakest area. If you think in one way, I've heard this analogy and I think it's really good. Satan is just like a really good quarterback. Because really, what did the best offenses do? They don't just do one thing. They know where the defense is weakest and they hit them. If they're playing a team that has a really good secondary, all right, they're going to run the ball. If they're playing a team with really good, linebackers, they're going to throw. They're going to hit you where you're weakest. And I think this passage helps us to remember that Satan is going to attack us at our desires. And so I think that helps us to put up those speed bumps. And it might look different for everybody. It might mean getting accountability. It might mean removing yourselves. It might mean just having a general awareness of your weaknesses. And when you're getting close to those things, it should definitely include having scripture memorized. These are the things that we can use, the tools to fight off the temptation. And because the consequences are severe, it brings forth death. You think of 1 Peter 5:8. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking one to devour. It's a scary thing when sin becomes fully grown. And I think when it says it becomes fully grown, gives this idea that at one point it's small. And I think with sin very often, it starts off small, and that's kind of, we nurture it and we don't think that it's going to harm us. It's a little bit like bringing a little lion cub into your house, right? It's cute for a little while, but if you could continue to feed it, it will become a beast that won't hesitate to eat you. And I think that's the illustration here. Every sin wants to be something bigger than it is. Lust wants to be adultery. Anger wants to be murder. Sin has a tendency to grow on its own when it's unchecked. And so what we have to do, and we will fail again and again and again, but we have to be constantly watchful and pruning and clipping back the sin, going back and watching the film, as it were, seeing the way we failed, analyzing the way you messed up. That's what a good athlete does. They watch their swing, they watch their tendencies, they look at the weaknesses, because Satan is certainly watching us. And are we watching ourselves too and seeing what our tendencies are and where we might get tripped up? I want to say a few things though too. Sometimes I think this topic starts to sound very legalistic. And I think that to a certain extent, I understand that, because sometimes I think we talk about these things as though this is how we become saved. I don't think that that's what James means here. I think that James is answering a very specific question. James is concerned that people may not be caring about their sin at all. He's worried about the person that might say something like, oh, there's sin in my life, but it isn't a big deal. After all, it's part of God's plan. He's the one that brings me into the situations, right? I'll be fine. I don't think James is so much thinking about that person who weeps over their sin, is repentant and is, in this broken, just constant, like I said, constantly repenting and constantly sorry for their sin. James is worried about the person that doesn't care at all. James, this is discipleship. This isn't so much justification. So I think that might help clear it up a little bit. But something else that I think helps understand this a little better is when we read in verse 12, it talks about the crown. What is the crown? The crown of life. This is also, the crown of life is mentioned in Revelation too. Something that's significant about this word is it's not so much a crown like we think of royalty. It's actually an athletic crown, the athletic wreath that would have been given to athletes in those times. And I think when we think of it in those categories, I think that can maybe help with the legalism a little bit. I think sometimes I know I sometimes struggle with thinking about working hard because I'm receiving this reward at the end. Well, think about what goes into an athletic competition. Getting a World Series ring, holding up that Lombardi trophy. I think the emotions tied up in an event like that, I think we naturally understand that it's not so much that the athlete is working hard and that they get that trophy and then that's the thing they want, but actually all of the work they did and all the struggle and toil gets wrapped up in that reward. I think if that makes sense. So there is something good about us to look forward to that day, to look forward to having success in fighting sin. That's not legalistic. It doesn't have to oppose that. Those two things are held very strongly in the Bible. And I think sometimes we, especially maybe Protestants, we sometimes lift up the, justification by faith alone. And then sometimes the works we want to say, oh, no, don't worry about that because we don't want to undermine grace. Well, James and Paul and Jesus say very strong things about temptation. They say flee from temptation, leads to death. So those are some thoughts on temptation. I hope they've been helpful to you. So that's it for this section. Next week we will look at verses 16 through 18 on gifts from above, and then 19 through 27 on being doers. Thanks for watching.